So I won't forget it because this is very good information. So we want to make sure that as many people as possible are able to see it. So and it's again, so it's a lot of information. And students, of course, who are taking history class, of course, this is really. But I think it's a great information for everybody, regardless whether you take history or not. It's just good stuff, good information to learn about less known perhaps facts, about our first president, George Washington. So I already, there was a long time ago, somebody asked about the cherry tree and George Washington, and I had no idea what was going on, and somehow I was completely caught off guard. And so, but I said, good things are that because we have a real expert tonight. So if you really want to know about the cherry tree and George Washington, you should ask the presenter. All right. So again, welcome everybody. I know a lot of people still will be joining in, but we need to kind of start, slowly, with the program. So again, let me introduce the speaker tonight. Again, my name is I guess I should introduce myself first, because you say, if you've never seen me before, say, my name is Dr. Bitoudis. I'm assistant professor of chemistry at Galveston College, and this is our lecture series at Galveston College, which is dedicated, as you can see from the screen, the diversity, inclusion, and empowerment. So we're really very fortunate tonight that we have a distinguished speaker, Dr. Schoelwer, Dr. Susan Schoelwer, who is expert and on the pretty much everything related to George Washington and his wife, right? And Martha Washington as well.
That's
right?
not everything.
Oh, okay, many things. Let me. I'm just going to give very brief introduction. And Susan Schoelwer is Executive Director of Historic Preservation and Collections, and Robert H. Smith, Senior Curator. And of course, she directs the architectural preservation, furnishing, and interpretation of George and Martha Washington's house and surrounding plantation buildings and landscape, as well as the creation of museum exhibitions, including the current award-winning special exhibition, Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. Again, congratulations with winning the award. It's I would be probably more more advantageous for us to be on in the place on the I guess, but Zoom is right now is the best we can do, or you coming here, maybe you can, you could have brought some, but I think it's going to be a wonderful opportunity. Again, so let me again one more time welcome everybody. I know a lot of people joining in, so but we're gonna start at some point because we don't have like that much time. So hopefully we have more people joining in. So again, welcome everybody, and let me again we are very fortunate to have a wonderful speaker, Dr. Susan Schoelwer, presenting, and again about award-winning exhibit that Lives Bound Together, and learning about George Washington and his wife, and that's going to be, I'm super excited. Okay, let me put that simply. Okay, so welcome to Galveston, at least virtually this time. In the future, hopefully we'll welcome you in real time. All right, so please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be with you this evening. I would, of course, much rather be there in person. I did have an opportunity to visit Galveston once, many years ago, and was disappointed not to be able to come last year. But then this is our third time, and third time is the charm. So I'm really glad to be here with you. So what you're looking at is the west front of George Washington's Mount Vernon, which most people know as the home of America's preeminent founding father, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and first president of a fledgling republic founded on those ringing words in the Declaration of Independence that, quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Washington was also a slave owner, inheriting 10 people when his father died when George was 11. He continued to own people throughout his life, and their labor made possible many of his accomplishments. When he died in 1799, he left a will providing for the slaves that he owned to be freed, intending to set an example that he hoped other slave owners would follow. Even so, his heirs brought new slaves to operate the plantation until the 1850s, when the estate was acquired by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association for the purpose of preserving it as a historic site. From then until today, the stated mission of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association has been to preserve Mount Vernon as it appeared in Washington's time, when it was a working agricultural enterprise, a plantation fueled by enslaved labor. So incorporating the enslaved community into Washington's story and the interpretation of Mount Vernon is, I believe, integral to the full understanding of both Washington and Mount Vernon, and necessary to the fulfillment of that core mission of preservation. In October 2016, Mount Vernon opened its first major special exhibition devoted to exploring the lives of the enslaved. Extended for nearly 5 years, it has become a cornerstone of Mount Vernon's ongoing efforts to present a more inclusive and authentic view of life on George and Martha Washington's estates. As we hope to suggest with the exhibition title, the lives of Washington and the individuals he enslaved were so closely intertwined, it is impossible to fully understand the former without considering the latter. The planning for this exhibition began in 2013, and we were really motivated by 3 main considerations. First, audience interest. Visitors knew that Washington owned slaves. They were coming to Mount Vernon asking questions and wanting to know more. Second, we thought we had a critical mass of evidence, including documents, original landscapes and structures, and archaeology. Washington's papers are voluminous. They run to some 70 published volumes. And as a result of his great attention to the nitty-gritty details of plantation management, they include rich information about the lives of enslaved individuals, down to the level of who might have been doing what job for how many hours in what field on a given summer day. And what I'm showing you is a list, a census that Washington made of all of the enslaved people on the Mount Vernon plantation in the summer of 1799, about 6 months before his death. And I'll be coming back to that shortly. I'll be talking more about that later. Original landscapes and structures. We have 450 acres of Washington's home farm with 15 original structures, not only the mansion, but also work buildings that supported it. The kitchen, which you see here, smokehouse, laundry, stable, all of those secondary buildings, outbuildings as we call them. Third, we have the findings of 35 years of systematic archaeological excavations focused on sites associated with the enslaved population on the estate. Thirdly, we believe that because of this evidence we had, that we also had a distinctive and important story to tell. These primary sources put us in position to move beyond the horrific statistics of the Middle Passage and the abstract generalizations about slavery as an institution, to encounter the details of individual lives, experiences, and families in a way that is rarely possible for enslaved people in 18th century America. Conceptually, George Washington is and remains at the center of Mount Vernon's reason for being. But for this exhibit, we wanted to link his story to that of the hundreds of enslaved people who were also integral to the human community and economic operations at Mount Vernon. So as visitors leave the historic area where the mansion and the outbuildings are, and they enter our museum galleries, they see this famous bust of George Washington through a glass wall that is etched with the names of 317 enslaved individuals living at Mount Vernon in 1799. Knowing these names connects us to the individuals and helps to make them real, replacing again those dehumanized abstractions with which we often talk about slavery. Once you enter the gallery, the bust is framed by 4 introductory wall panels. This one makes 3 key points. First, it underlines our effort to strike a balance between acknowledging the painful legacy of slavery and affirming the strength and humanity of those who were enslaved. Second, it calls out the importance of vocabulary, noting our conscious decision to avoid using the word slave when referring to individuals, replacing this term with enslaved to emphasize that this was not an inherent identity, but an imposed status. Third, it offers what I think is a really vivid infographic on Mount Vernon's permanent residence. So in 1799, as this chart suggests, down at the bottom in the green, there were 5 Washington family members. In the red, there were approximately 20 paid white employees, both hired and indentured, and there were 317 enslaved men, women, and children spread out across Washington's 5 cultivated farms covering 8,000 acres. And you see in the background an aerial view of the area surrounding the mansions and then looking down to the view of the Potomac River. Knowing these numbers profoundly shifts our sense of what the Mount Vernon community looked like in the last year of George Washington's life. So as I look at this overview of the landscape and think about, the community of people, the number of people who are working and living on that landscape. Turning into the first main gallery, some visitors may be surprised to be greeted by elegant drinking and dining wares, goods that made up the Washington's world, both the imperial and commercial world of the British Atlantic and the intimate domestic world of the household. Here, we endeavor to prompt visitors to consider household goods in different ways. Not only who made or owned an object like the silver coffee pot or the Chinese porcelain teapot, but whose hands touched it, who cleaned and polished it, and more broadly, whose labor created the wealth that purchased it. By asking new questions, we came to see that stories of the enslaved are embedded in virtually every object in our collection. In a global context, silver and porcelain vessels for serving elite beverages, coffee or tea, chocolate or punch, are juxtaposed against graphics of the transatlantic sugar trade and the brutal Middle Passage that carried millions of captive Africans to slavery in the Americas. In a household context, these same items are not only elite luxuries, but nodes of connection between owners and the enslaved, as suggested by the dining table vignette set for dinner with the President and Mrs. Washington. Designing the exhibition presented two key challenges. The first challenge was an overload of information. Presenting this complex topic entailed lots of words. Even having edited and edited and edited down the script still exceeded 25,000 words, which is something like 50 book pages. How could we make this amount of text digestible in an exhibition context? And so I show you the example of one large label, which gives a sense of our solution, which was to use graphic design to create a dynamic layering of text, visually distinguishing different categories of information. So the alternating kinds of fonts with serif and sans serif typefaces give a visual variety and create, I think, bursts of information. The period quotations are always in italics, and the keywords and phrases and sentences are bolded so that if you're walking through the exhibition, you can effectively skim it and follow the storyline. Or if you see something that intrigues you, you can dig deeper into topics of particular interest. The second major challenge to presenting this in an exhibition context was a dearth of imagery. We very much wanted the exhibition to have a human presence, but how to do that for individuals whose appearance is largely unknown? Photography, of course, did not exist in the 18th century, and paintings and drawings of enslaved individuals of the period are rare and often unreliable as portraits, as we'll see. Our solution here was to select 17 adults whose life stories we could present in some detail, representing a variety of experiences: men and women, house servants and field workers, skilled artisans, an enslaved overseer, some who attained freedom and others who fled slavery but were recaptured. We were concerned that any attempt at full-scale portraiture would imply a level of certainty about appearances that we didn't have. So we settled on silhouettes as both period appropriate and capable of suggesting different presences without being too realistic. But the concept of silhouettes in turn required experimentation. The initial pilot was a literal recreation of a traditional black and white silhouette, seen in the figure on the left, which represents the Washington's butler, Frank Lee. This seemed too black and white and too formal, aligned with pictorial formats that 18th century individuals certainly did not have access to. So our next attempt, you see in the center of the mock-up of the exhibition, was a translucent figure etched on a life-size panel of acrylic. Now the idea here was that the translucency would sort of convey the idea that 18th century enslaved people were present, omnipresent perhaps in some cases, but expected to be invisible. We consulted at this point with some community focus groups, both descendants of individuals enslaved at Mount Vernon and members of local organizations like the Black History Museum in the nearby town of Alexandria. But they roundly rejected this idea. They found the translucency ghostly, and they understandably objected to the irony of sort of white figures representing enslaved Black people. The final iteration struck what I think is a middle ground, as you see on the left now with the figure of Frank Lee as finally included in the exhibit, echoing textures of period wood engravings. And you see the figure of Frank Lee here in a passage in the exhibit that I think is one of the most illuminating and successful, combining period documentation with surviving objects. The scene represents an afternoon coffee enjoyed on the piazza, recorded by the architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe, who later went on to design the U.S. Capitol. He visited the Washingtons in the summer of 1796, and he wrote about it at length in his diary. So the accompanying text prompts visitors to read between the lines, considering what, that is, who is missing from Latrobe's account. So, for instance, he says, I sent him my letter of introduction. Well, who would have received that letter of introduction? Frank Lee, the butler. Dinner was served up about 3. Coffee was brought. Who carried out those duties? Who brought my horses to the door? And this is a part of the exhibit that has been very useful for teachers working with students on how to interpret primary text, how to ask new questions of these period documents. The next gallery poses a question frequently asked by visitors, and one on which many have strong opinions, ranging from those who want to construe Washington as a, quote, good slave owner who treated his people better than some masters and ultimately freed them in his will, to others for whom his slave owning negates the high regard accorded him for his essential and undeniable contributions in establishing the American Republic. So here our approach was to focus on presenting key points of evidence, in particular acknowledging the reality of Washington's slave owning, as well as the divergence after the Revolution between his growing private antipathy to slavery and his public neutrality, based on his conviction that bitter debates over slavery would tear apart the fragile nation, which was his first priority. William Lee, the general's valet, who was in fact the butler of the brother of Frank Lee, the butler. William Lee was the general's valet through the entire Revolutionary War. And he has traditionally been identified with the attendant that you see in the background of this portrait of George Washington by John Trumbull. He's portrayed as a slight, boyish figure on horseback with an exotic plumed headdress. As a portrait of the historical William Lee, however, this figure is unreliable. The artist would presumably have known Lee during Trumbull's 3-week stint as Washington's aide-de-camp in 1775, but the portrait was not painted until nearly 5 years later when Trumbull was in London. He may have had a portrait study of Washington to work from, but his depiction of Lee would have had to have been taken from memory based on an unknown London model, or more likely, as art historians have long noted, drawing on an established tradition of showing European military leaders and aristocrats portrayed with dark-skinned, exotically clad attendants. Really, these individuals are functioning more as accessories to the main subject than as individuals in their own right. So this led us to ask, well, what do we know of William Lee as an individual? George Washington's will describes him as, quote, my mulatto man, meaning he was likely light-skinned and of mixed-race ancestry. We know he rode with George Washington on fox hunts and throughout the Revolution, and Washington was famed really, as the best horseman of the age. We know Lee was entrusted with considerable responsibility during the war, organizing papers and carrying George Washington's spyglass and other gear. When injuries to both knees made it impossible for him to continue as Washington's valet during the presidency, he was sent back to Mount Vernon and reassigned to shoemaking. He was singled out in George Washington's will for immediate freedom upon the general's death. And these points, although they're scant, I think they allow us to conjecture a different vision of William Lee. Not an untried youth, but a mature man, not a soldier in arms, but nonetheless a veteran of the war, muscular and athletic, to be capable of being able to ride for 8 years with the general. And so I think, we have tried to represent him in quite a different way than he has traditionally been seen. The largest gallery of the exhibit focuses on daily life of Mount Vernon's 5 farms. And again, the topic presented additional challenges. First, we have no written evidence from the perspective of the enslaved themselves. We can only chronicle physical conditions and circumstances, extrapolated from wordless archaeological evidence and the records created by others, primarily George Washington, but also family members and visitors to the estate. Second, we wanted to juxtapose two overarching themes. On the one hand, again, acknowledging the harsh reality of slavery. The men, women, and children enslaved at Mount Vernon had little control over their lives. They had no legal rights and could have been sold or separated from family members at any time. On the other hand, we wanted to affirm the dignity and humanity of these individuals who experienced life in bondage. They demonstrated strength and resilience as they formed families, created tight-knit communities, found ways to earn money, acquired personal possessions, and resisted the bonds of slavery. And these are some of the aspects of their lives that we've tried to represent in this segment of the exhibit. Archaeological resources provide us a sense of physical living conditions. What we know of foodways comes largely from an excavation of a large pit in the center of a communal slave dwelling called the House for Families. This pit was excavated in the 1980s, and it revealed more than 80,000 bones representing 55 species, including wild game, domestic animals, and fish. Also, 33 different types of seeds, nutshells, and field crops. This material offered groundbreaking information on slavery in the Chesapeake. And what it tells us, or what it demonstrates, is the significant initiative that enslaved people took in supplementing the restricted rations that they were given, basically cornmeal and fish, dried fish. Ceramic fragments of a teapot, a cream jug, and a cup allow us to suggest the scene described by a visitor in a slave cabin on one of George Washington's outlying farms. These are all fragments that were excavated from that pit beneath the communal slave dwelling, and it corresponds to this description from 1798, where the visitor, a Polish nobleman, comments on seeing these very scarce, scanty living conditions, but yet, as he put it, in the middle of this poverty, some cups and a teapot. So clearly trying to make a better life and really aware of prevailing styles. Some archaeological findings proved surprising. Notably, gunflint and 600 pieces of lead shot, demonstrating that enslaved people used firearms to hunt wild game, which they sometimes sold to Washington for his table. One accomplished hunter was African-born carpenter Sambo Anderson, who you see on the left, a representation of him, whose gun ownership is documented by a firearms license issued by Fairfax County after he received his freedom in 1801. Turning to clothing and personal appearance, George Washington's detailed records allow us to suggest the livery, the uniforms, the red and white uniforms that were worn by household and coach attendants, in contrast to the rough and limited garments provided to field hands, who were primarily female. Archaeology also provides examples of actual buttons, buckles, beads, watch fobs, and other articles of adornment belonging to the enslaved, demonstrating again an awareness of style and a participation in consumer economies. Archaeology provides a window onto the work of skilled craftspeople, such as coopers making barrels, distillers making whiskey, carpenters, blacksmiths, grooms, dairymaids, spinners. A lawn roller and watering can speak to the knowledge and labor needed to maintain Washington's picturesque landscape and ornamental and kitchen gardens. Field hands are the hardest to know of the enslaved workers, but George Washington's weekly farm reports document assignments in such detail that we can reconstruct not only seasonal cycles of work, but we can also conjecture a day in the life of field hands, beginning with their rising before sunset so that they would be rising before sunrise, so they would be expected to work from sunrise to sunset, and only after sunset would they have their own time to take care of their own families, cook food, tend their gardens, and so forth. The weekly reports, and you see one example here, provide a wealth of information on personal lives: clothing allotments, childbirth, illness, deaths, births, attempts at escape. In April 1792, for example, we know that 3 men and 9 women at Muddy Hole Farm were at work harrowing oats and clover, hauling stones, and setting rail fences. Molly was sick, and Kate was caring for her 12-year-old son, Billy, who died by the end of the week. We entered these and other references into a database, and we found we had more than 35,000 data points. What links these references together is that census that I showed at the beginning that Washington compiled in 1799, listing the 317 men, women, and children, their ages, if known. Here's the column with their ages. Their family members, no husband, husband, wife, so forth. Their children, their occupations, which of the 5 farms they were assigned to, their property status, whether they were owned by George Washington, by the estate of Martha Washington's first husband, or rented, and their physical condition, sometimes noted as lame, dwarf, or past labor. This interpretation enables us to identify these people in other references. So here we see Washington's listing for Priscilla, or Scylla as she was known, a 36-year-old field worker with 6 children ages 1 to 14. They lived and worked on Dogue Run Farm, located up here, about 3 miles away from the Mansion House Farm, where Scylla's husband and the father of her children, Slammin' Joe, was a ditcher. He was allowed to visit the family on Sundays, plus unauthorized visits at night, which Washington called night walking. For some, we can trace kinships through multiple generations, a detail of a complexity, individuality, and continuity that is very rare for enslaved people in 18th century America. Often there may be only one documentary reference to a person's entire life. Presenting this information in an exhibit format was also a challenge because it required more text than could be incorporated in a standard label. So we created interactive tablets for the 17 featured individuals. For each, the frame contains that basic information with a touch screen to explore the timelines, maps, family trees, what we know about personal appearance. Now, unfortunately, touch screens are sadly unavailable right now due to COVID, but the information is available on our website, this information on all 17 of these individuals. Another section of the exhibit considers community life, how Mount Vernon's enslaved people dealt with universal experiences like birth, illness, and death, how they incorporated music, storytelling, religion, customs, and ceremonies in their lives. When it came to topics of resistance and punishment, the message from Descendants and local African American constituents was clear: don't sugarcoat the brutality of slavery. So to this end, we tried to present documented examples of both resistance, from working slowly or feigning illness, to breaking tools or attempting escape, and also punishment, including demotion to less desirable jobs, whipping, quote, when warranted, Washington said, and very rarely sale. The final section of the exhibition begins with Washington's death and the execution of that clause in his will by which he provided for the 123 individuals that he owned to be freed at the death of Martha Washington. He did not free the 150 Mount Vernon people who were owned by the estate of Martha's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, known as the dower slaves. He was not legally enabled to do that. This final gallery was the direct result of our outreach to descendants and local African American residents who said, you can't just end the story in 1799, you need to talk about what happened next. Well, what happened immediately in the aftermath of Washington's death was the breaking up of an enslaved community that had evolved over 4 decades. Families were split, with the enslavement of children following the status of the mother. The 150 Custis dower slaves were divided up between Martha Washington's 4 grandchildren, just as her household goods, like the silver candlestick that you see in the case, were. Later, Washington heirs brought new communities of enslaved to Mount Vernon until the 1850s. After the purchase of the estate by Mount Vernon and Ladies Association in 1860, local African Americans were hired back as paid employees: farm workers, gardeners, guards, butler, housekeeper, and they often served as the primary interface with visitors. The creation of Lives Bound Together was built on ongoing work of memorializing, researching, interpreting slavery at Mount Vernon, beginning as early as 1860 with the association's founder, Anne Pamela Cunningham. When the Mount Vernon Ladies Association first took over Mount Vernon, it was not in good physical condition, and there was a real question about how they were going to go about preserving this entire property of some 200 acres and all these buildings. And many experts of the period advised, just focus on the mansion and George Washington's tomb. No one is ever going to care about all those other buildings. But to her credit, Anne Pamela Cunningham said, the vision is to preserve Mount Vernon as George Washington knew it, and that means all of the buildings. And so as a result, we do have this rich resource of original structures. The exhibition concludes with moving comments by 6 descendants of the people enslaved at Mount Vernon, talking about their family histories, how they came to know their connection to George Washington, what it feels like to them to walk the grounds where their kin were enslaved, how they regard George Washington. And those interviews are also available on our website. I think one of the key impacts of the exhibit has to bring together these raw materials of primary research and make this information accessible to frontline interpreters in our historic area, to teachers and students from grammar school to college, to academic research and popular historians, to television programming, to programs like this, to visitors from around the country. And many comments from visitors tell us that this was their first opportunity to really learn about the lives of enslaved people in the 18th century. Of particular value has been the ability to talk about slavery through the stories and experiences of individual lives rather than faceless statistics. Today, Mount Vernon offers countless opportunities to inquire and learn about Washington, slavery, and the enslaved community of Mount Vernon, both on and off site. Visitors to the estate are offered 2 self-guiding maps, a general guide that includes all sites of interest, including those particularly pertaining to the enslaved community, and a special subject guide highlighting specific elements of the estate and providing further background information on Washington and slavery. Effectively, an extension of Lives Bound Together out onto the landscape itself. Updated scholarship has been incorporated into all our daily programming, from the standard mansion tour to an Enslaved People of Mount Vernon tour that offers opportunities for discussion while visiting key sites. These include a reconstructed slave cabin representing living quarters on the outlying farms, as well as the greenhouse slave quarter, which is a reconstruction of the structure Washington built in 1792 to house most of the workers at Mansion House Farm. The Enslaved People Tour concludes at the Slave Memorial and Cemetery, located on a high ridge about 50 miles southwest of the Washington's tomb. Since 2013, Mount Vernon archaeologists, with the encouragement of descendants and local community groups, have undertaken ongoing investigations to locate and ultimately commemorate individual burial sites. This is accomplished, you can see the workers there in the foreground, by carefully removing the top layers of soil until changes in color and texture reveal the top of grave shafts, which are then recorded in our master GPS mapping system, so that no human remains are ever disturbed in the process. To date, we've located 86 graves. You can see those color changes in color in the soil, thought to include both some free individuals such as William Lee, as well as enslaved adults and children. Guests on the estate have opportunities to speak with character interpreters enacting the roles of enslaved men and women. Here's Reginald Richards as butler Frank Lee, and Brenda Parker as housemaid Caroline Branham, seen in a video on the enslaved house servants, part of our online tour of the mansion. Now, I hope that you will all someday have an opportunity to visit Mount Vernon, and we are currently open with limited capacity. But in the meantime, for those who cannot come in person, the website does have a rich array of content illuminating Washington and the enslaved community. I did a website search for slavery, and I came up with more than 37,000 hits. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of duplication in there, but there is a lot of information. And I want to just highlight a few of the key portals. For general audiences, we offer the exhibition script, the videos, the biographies, descendant interviews, and the 4-minute introductory video. A virtual tour of the exhibition is forthcoming, and I'm told it's going to be launched any day now. For researchers, the database contains more than 35,000 individual references to the enslaved, extracted from Washington's papers, identifying a total of 577 individuals who lived and worked at Mount Vernon during Washington's residence. For teachers, we offer an array of curriculum materials with nationwide programs that introduce materials into diverse learning communities. One of our most recent productions last October was an online symposium, Teaching Slavery in Washington's World, which offers 16 hours of programming and had more than 1,000 registrants from across the country, plus Canada and Europe. So what have we learned from doing this exhibition? Well, I think first of all, we learned how much there is to learn and how many resources are available. And this was a major breakthrough to come to understand this. I remember clearly that when I first came to Mount Vernon in 2010, we had, this is on the left, you see an illustration, an image from our manuscripts gallery in the exhibit galleries. And there was one case, that standing case in the background, and I was told that was a case on slavery. And I was told, it's really hard to find things to put in that case. We really don't have that much on slavery. In fact, as I hope I've suggested this evening, we have a multitude of evidence, perhaps as much or more than any other 18th century plantation in America. Much of that evidence had been long hiding in plain sight. We just hadn't been asking the right questions. And so the second thing I think we learned is the importance of always questioning the evidence and seeking out the primary sources. Each generation asks new questions, and the information that we find in secondary sources in published books may have been based on differing questions than we're answering today, or based on evidence that was not then available. The third thing that we learned, of course, is all the information that we gathered about the lives of these individuals at Mount Vernon, their relation to Washington. Some of that is summarized in the exhibition catalog, Lives Bound Together, which is available from our bookshop. And so research continues, culminating last year in the publication of a book called The Only Unavoidable Subject of Regret, which was the result of 4 decades of groundbreaking research by our estate historian, Mary Thompson. She started working on the subject of slavery at Mount Vernon in the 1980s. And based on that research has brought out this book, which in combination with the findings of our archaeology team is truly the foundation of all the material that I've presented this evening. This book was recently awarded a Best Biography Prize from the Society for the History of Early American Republic. to the author of an original biography broadly defined of a person active during the era of the early republic. And I want to just quote from that award in closing. Quote, while not a traditional biography of Washington, the book is an essential contribution to the study of his life, revealing his character through his practice of slavery, the cultural and social economic foundation of his identity as an elite 18th century Virginian. The book amounts to new required reading on the first subject in American biography. Slavery at Mount Vernon was fundamental to George Washington's character and life, and those in turn have the broadest implications for how we approach the founders in general. And so I think considering all this information, it really does give us a different view of George Washington, of Mount Vernon. We understand the place in time differently. And so again, I hope that you all will get to come in person. In the meantime, please check out our resources on the website. And please, if you have questions, I'm here to try and answer. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me thank you so much for this wonderful, very informative presentation, which is, definitely kind of sheds light of less known, facts about the life of the first president and his wife. And again, thank you so much. It was, really, again, it is amazing to see these actual things. When you said about the finger, did they, like people asking if how many people touched that cup, or who was touching it, that's kind of makes it like very real, right? It's other than, kind of imagining things, you could actually kind of see, and details about kind of distinguished, personalities. I mean, like the person who followed George Washington through the war, right? So
right.
That's I did not know that. So all right, again, I'm sure there will be some people who would like to ask questions. I'm sure Dr. Schoelwer would be willing to answer some of those. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Well,
right,
I'll try.
Okay, so please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask the question. Okay. All right. Anybody is willing who would like to ask the question?
Yeah, I'll start off. I was curious, where does the Vernon from Mount Vernon come from?
Yeah.
Is that a person or?
Good question. The question is, where does the Vernon in Mount Vernon come from? The plantation was really first started by, the land was first given to George Washington's great-grandfather, and he named it Little Hunting Creek Plantation. It was after George Washington's father died, what became Mount Vernon was inherited by George's older half-brother, Lawrence Washington. Lawrence Washington had fought in the War for Jenkins' Ear in the Caribbean under the British commander Edward Vernon. And so when he came back from that war in the Caribbean, he renamed the plantation Mount Vernon in honor of his commanding officer. Edward Vernon was a big hero in the British Atlantic in the 1730s.
And what about the cherry tree?
The cherry tree. The cherry tree is a story that has no basis in fact, but it was written about in early biographies of George Washington by a biographer named Parson Weems. And he was interested in really portraying Washington as a model for children to emulate moral behavior. And so he created this story that George Washington, as a young boy, 7 or 8 years old, had been given an axe. And he, according to the story, he went out and he used his new axe and he chopped down a cherry tree, a young cherry tree, which was his father's pride and joy. And when his father, being quite angry, said, "Who chopped down my cherry tree?" George Washington said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. It was I." Again, no basis in fact, but interesting story. We actually have in the collection a shadow box that has a notary republic, a notarized statement written in the 1950s, stating that the piece of wood in that box is from a branch of the cherry tree that George Washington chopped down as a boy long before he was famous. So just think about all of the twists and turns that that story has taken.
All right.
The moral of the story is don't tell a lie.
Okay. All right. Anybody else would like to ask a question?
Yes, I have one. Dr. Schoelwer, can you talk about the enslaved people that Washington brought with him to help when he became president? I think he took a handful from Mount Vernon and to the presidential residence. Is that correct?
Yes, there were 9 enslaved people from Mount Vernon who were part of the presidential household in New York and then in Philadelphia. 8 of those were owned by the Custis estate, in fact. They were Martha Washington's enslaved people, and it makes sense that those were the people that accompanied the household because they knew how she wanted her household run. So I think, well, that is the identities of the people who went with them to New York and then to Philadelphia. Did you have an additional question there?
No, that was it. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else would like to ask a question?
Yeah, I was wondering how much the estate is worth today. It's a lot of land and stuff there. I mean, back in the day, it was probably like a lot less, but how much would it be worth today?
How much is the estate worth today? I have no idea. We currently own about 450 acres. That's a big chunk of land in Northern Virginia, which is heavily developed. I'm sure one could go into property records and figure out what is an average price per acre, but I haven't done that calculation.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else would like to ask a question?
Yeah, I'm curious, do you have any records of how many other presidents actually visited that estate while he was alive?
Not off the top of my head. Certainly Jefferson visited at some point. Madison would have visited. Adams did not visit. To my knowledge, Monroe did not visit. So that would leave us with, I believe, 2. Of course, others came later to visit. It was already becoming a shrine, kind of a national shrine that people came to visit after Washington's death, before it was purchased by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. So there have been many presidents come to visit after Washington's death, but I think we only have those 2 during his lifetime.
Okay, anybody else would like to ask a question? Okay, so I'd like to ask one question also. So after George Washington in his will freed all his slaves, right?
He freed the slaves that he personally owned, which was 123 slaves.
Okay.
And he did not free them outright. The only one who he freed outright was William Lee, the man who served as his valet. The others that he owned, he provided were to be freed on the death of Martha Washington. She died about 2.5 years after George Washington. He died in December of 1799. She ended up freeing his slaves at the beginning of January 1801, so about a year later. And there is some evidence that she was afraid for her life. It makes sense that if there are 123 people depending on your life to be freed, that there might have been some threats. And then the 150 people that were that were Custis Dower slaves remained in the Custis estate and were inherited by Martha Washington's heirs. And then there were 40 people who belonged to another local landowner, and they went back to that landowner. So it's a complicated situation, because if you have families that have formed in that community over those 40 years, and the husband is freed, but the wife and the children would then remain enslaved. Some, like Sambo Anderson, remained in the area and was able to earn money as a freeman and actually buy the freedom of several of his family members. If it is the mother who is freed with the children, then you have someone who probably has fewer cash producing skills if you've been working as a field hand your entire life. So for many people, it created both a emotionally wrenching and economically difficult situation, but nonetheless, freedom itself was the goal.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Did you mention, is he buried on the estate?
Yes, he is. He was originally buried in the family tomb, which was created in the mid-18th century. Also held his half-brother Lawrence and about 25 other people. A new tomb was built in the 1830s, and all of the bodies were moved there.
And how about children? Did he have any children?
The Washingtons did not have any children of their own. Martha Washington had 2 living children by her first marriage. Her daughter, Patsy, died at about age 16. We think she probably had epilepsy. Her son, Jackie, died at about age 27, a couple weeks after Washington's victory at the Battle of Yorktown. But before he died, he fathered 4 children. So Martha's grandchildren, the younger 2 of whom were raised by George and Martha Washington. So they had no children of their own, but they raised 2 families.
Okay. Do you know if anybody from the, all these enslaved people that have the descendants of, the enslaved people from George Washington states have contacted you?
Yes, since the 1980s, we have been contacted by a number of people who can trace their family relationships back to people who were enslaved on the estate. Since the exhibit has opened, we have met a few more of those. 6 of the people whom we knew are featured in these oral history videos. And I understand that they are now coming together to form kind of their own association, that they can share memories and do genealogical research and so forth.
Wow, that's remarkable.
But the people that we know, we pretty much know because they have come to us, because they have preserved the information in their families. It has proven difficult to trace forward in time from the people enslaved at Mount Vernon. Mm-hmm. But we'd be thrilled to hear from anyone else who has that kind of lineage and family tradition.
That's indeed very interesting. It's do you know, during the war, Revolutionary War, where part of his entourage, there was Lee, right? His valet was always with him.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Were there any more enslaved people with him during the war?
William Lee was the only one of his enslaved people that accompanied him during the war. Martha Washington spent about half of the war in camp at headquarters. And that is an excellent question, because I don't know that she brought anyone with her, but I haven't specifically looked at that question. And I don't know what other generals or officers might have had people with them, but I'm sure that there would have been. Well, I know there would have been. I know there is one battle where Lee is said to have gathered a number of the other enslaved people as kind of a defensive unit. But I don't know who all those are, and that's a great question.
Mhm. All right. Thank you so much. I mean, that is, very, very informative. Of course, visiting Mount Vernon. How long does it take to go? I mean, every place. I mean, in the state. I mean, probably like a couple of days.
I think that, you could easily spend a full day visiting everything.
Wow. Okay, that's so. I guess one needs to allocate at least a day or two. If one.
If you're planning a visit and you go on our website, it has estimates of how long it takes to visit particular elements of the estate, so you can do the math. Where
Okay, Susan, can you? I cannot. We cannot hear you.